Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 134th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were begun in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased this morning to welcome Arthur Sulzberger Jr. to the Landon podium to join 133 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and opinions on the issues of the day. Kansas State University is also very pleased to welcome today a top-level delegation from the Department of Defense of Angola. General Agostinho Nalumba is the Chief of Defense. And would he please stand? Thank you very much. Thank you. And the General has with him some of the top admirals and generals of the Angolan military. Gentlemen, would you please stand? Thank you very much for coming. We are pleased that Major Nick Lovelace, the Defense and Army Attaché for the United States government in Angola, is hosting the visit. Major Lovelace is a Kansas State University graduate. So, Major, thank you very much. Please, thank you very much. And then I would also like to welcome Gail Gregg, the wife of Arthur Sulzberger. Gail is a 1972 K-State graduate. How about that? Where is Gail? Oh, there she is. Well, Gail worked for the K-State Collegian and was co-managing editor of our student newspaper, so we thank you for your years of service to the Collegian as well. Thank you. Well, before introducing our speaker, I'd like to introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Jackie Spears, Professor of Education, President of our outstanding KSU Faculty Senate. Jackie, thank you. Next to her is our student body president, a junior in finance, Haley Urkovich. Haley? On my right, Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president and chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. In introducing Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the chairman and publisher of the New York Times, I want to thank our good friend and colleague, Ed Seaton, for using his influence and arm twisting to get Arthur here so that he would give this Landon Lecture. Arthur became the chairman of the New York Times Company in 1997 and had become the publisher of the New York Times in 1992. He continues to run the company's flagship enterprise on a day-to-day basis. During his tenure as publisher, the New York Times has earned, now think about this, 27 Pulitzer Prizes, 27 Pulitzer Prizes, and received international praise for the coverage of the September 11th terrorist attacks. In articles called A Nation Challenged and Portraits of Grief, the New York Times Company was ranked #1 in the publishing industry and Fortune magazine's list of America's most admired companies, and this for the 4th consecutive year. He received an undergraduate degree in political science from Tufts University, and he's a 1985 graduate of the Harvard Business School's program for management development. Well, there is no doubt that the New York Times is America's and probably the world's most authoritative and most quoted newspaper. We are pleased this morning to welcome to the Landon podium its chairman and publisher, Arthur Sulzberger Jr. Arthur?
Good morning, and thank you, John, for that most generous introduction. My thanks to all of you for being here today, and for coming all the way from Angola in particular. It's good for this proud son of Kansas to be home again. And as you all now know, I have roots in the Sunflower State. Some of the seminal moments in my life occurred only an hour's drive from here. 33 years ago, my mother moved to Topeka. And it was 3 years after that I met and successfully wooed my wife, Gail Gregg. She remembers K-State and her days as co-managing editor of the Collegian with great fondness. But there's another interesting connection that links me with this particular town. So let me tell you a story which some of you may know, but I hope not most of you. In 1855, two early pioneer settlements joined with the New England Immigrant Aid Society and established a new town, and they called it New Boston. Only a few months had passed when another group of settlers whose boat had twice grounded on sandbars found themselves stranded near that town of New Boston. They were quickly invited to join the community, but this second group, this new group, had one condition. They had to rename the town Manhattan. Apparently, the good folks of New Boston were practical people, and they knew how to compromise, which, by the way, is an important theme of this speech, because a constitution for the new town of Manhattan was adopted on June 19th, 1855. Since I am the chairman of a company with one major newspaper located in that other Manhattan, and another major newspaper located in that other Boston, I feel a genuine kinship with the people of this great and wonderfully named community. And I am looking forward to returning to New York because I want to lead an effort to rename some part of our city Aggieville. We could use an Aggieville. I am, of course, telling you all of this in an absolutely shameless effort to gain your sympathy and your support. It also serves to make a larger point. Geographical and philosophical-based assumptions can be very misleading. Yes, I have a blue state upbringing and a very blue state job. I have also been provided with a healthy dose of red state influences. These include my wonderful in-laws. My mother-in-law, Ann Gregg, is here today, and many, many great friends, such as Ed Seaton, who, quite frankly, didn't have to do a lot of arm twisting to get me here, sir. But Ed is clearly the legendary editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Mercury, but he's more than that. Former president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors and one of my profession's most respected leaders. This lecture series' namesake and honoree, Alf Landon, understood that life tended not to fall into neat categories or linear storylines. The former Republican presidential candidate was once asked whom he regarded as the great Americans of the 20th century, and he answered, Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Woodrow Wilson might have been if he'd been willing to make some more compromises. So might have John F. Kennedy if he had lived. I think you would also have to include John L. Lewis and Samuel Gompers. He knew that this was a surprising list, perhaps even a shocking one, coming from a man with his GOP affiliation, but the former governor of Kansas admitted, my record for party regularity is not impressive. I am proud to say that today I will be following in the great man's footsteps as I try to take a non-ideological and common sense look at how the use and misuse of news and information is undermining our American political system, how the news media is struggling with its traditional role as an impartial analyst, interpreter, and commentator, and how audiences across the country are coping with all the discord and disconnection of our increasingly uncivil society. Now more than a few of you may be thinking, who is this guy trying to kid? The publisher of the New York Times obviously has a system of beliefs that affect the opinions and endorsements that appear in the paper daily. And of course I have a system of beliefs, just like every other newspaper publisher in the country, and like I hope all of you and even the folks who are protesting us today. In my case, my belief system is generally reflected in the editorial page of the New York Times. Just pick a position, whether it's abortion, welfare reform, farm subsidies, gun control, Iraq, the First Amendment, and our paper's editorial board will have something meaningful, I hope, to say about it. You may not agree, but that's okay. It is debate that keeps our democracy alive and vibrant. Now let me pause for a moment to make an educational aside. For many don't fully understand the difference between our editorial and our news pages in American newspapers. At the Times, and indeed at most serious newspapers, we have built-in rigorous safeguards to confine such debates as those you'll read on the editorial and op-ed pages there, and to keep our news pages separate from our opinion pages. Both in the case of the Times, for example, they are run by separate editors, and they don't have interlinking responsibilities. But now let me return to the speech. The incredible shrill tone of discourse these days shows that our ability to have a rational and productive conversation about anything important in this country is becoming more difficult. Because of this, it is growing near to impossible to thoughtfully address our most pressing challenges. When presidential campaigns spend a preponderance, of their time talking about what their opponents did or did not do in a war that ended 30 years ago, they're not really focusing on the challenges of the here and now, Iraq or jobs, medicine for our elderly, the challenges of our national debt. When that happens, we have serious problems. Today I will talk about how we find it so hard to communicate calmly and respectfully with each other, and then offer some suggestions as to how the public sector, the news media, and the citizenry can all help to reestablish a more productive and enlightened national discourse. Since we are thankfully only 50 days away from Election Day, let's start by talking about politics and how the practice of the art of the possible is fundamentally changing how we communicate with each other. There was a time when we used to tolerate the craziness of our campaigns. We knew this was a period of temporary insanity. Every couple of years, the political parties would let off a little steam, accuse their opponents of every imaginable misdeed, and then once the votes were tallied, go back to the very hard work of governing. And just occasionally, if the elected officials were sufficiently forthright and bold, they were able to actually claim that they had a mandate to pursue a particular program or proposal. And most remarkably, things actually changed, sometimes even for the better. Regrettably, in this case, neither of the presidential campaigns is elevating the tone of our national discourse. On the contrary, all we hear are charges and countercharges. What is amazing to me is that two guys who went to the same university, indeed belonged to the same secret eating club, could attack each other with such incredible gusto. It's like a hazing ritual gone terribly wrong. Lately, politics has become so rhetorically zany that it feels as if some crazy novelist is writing our daily headlines, but folks, you can't make this stuff up. After all, who would have thought that the phrase girly men would become an important macroeconomic concept in our nation's debates about growth rate and unemployment? Or that an article written in 1946 about post-World War II European reconstruction by the legendary New York Times journalist Anne O'Hare McCormick, the first woman, by the way, to win the Pulitzer Prize, would be castigated, inappropriately I must say, in the president's convention acceptance dress. From what I understand of Anne, he's lucky she's not alive. He'd be in big trouble. And now, with the help of a few totally independent 527 committees, and if you believe those are totally independent, I have a bridge in the other Manhattan to sell you, we are beginning to hear some world-class name-calling. Both campaigns are absolutely convinced that launching a huge deluge of negative ads is the only way to ensure that their dollars are most effectively spent. While the candidates and their spokespersons may talk a positive game, the political advisors and insiders have collectively decided it's time to go for the jugular, or maybe even lower. And while the upcoming presidential debates should be highly entertaining, they will unfortunately cast a lot more heat than light on the major issues that our nation is now confronting. As we all know, there are long-term consequences to all of this. We can begin with the fact that it's now far more difficult to discuss public policy challenges. What should be a thoughtful, deliberative process has become instead another venue for highly partisan combat and bickering. The result is legislative gridlock at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level. It's even starting to have an effect on our nation's judicial system. To the surprise of no one, the public has become full participants in these angry squabbles, and this makes it even harder to achieve the necessary compromises on major issues. As I mentioned earlier, we could learn a lesson from those practical problem-solving citizens of New Boston. When advocates from both the left and the right shout down the voices of moderation, we will inevitably fail to reach what the great historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. calls the vital center. And finally, too many news outlets enjoy their role as another actor in the political theater of the absurd as they add more fuel to the verbal fire. It was not so long ago that people looked to the press and to their favorite journalists to act as an arbiter of truth, to provide some insight into the great debates of our day. We all remember when a Scotty Reston or a Walter Cronkite could almost single-handedly define the terms of our national discourse. In 2004, news anchors and others whose core job is to be impartial are too frequently joining the fray as ideological cheerleaders and doing all they can to contribute to our nation's political gridlock. In fact, the producers of the cable news channels know full well that perceived ideological bias is attracting particular segments of viewers. For example, during the Republican National Convention, Fox News was dominant, while CNN did much better during the Democratic National Convention. I'm not suggesting that those two have the same journalistic values. Fox is more overtly partisan, but both, along with much of cable TV, blur the distinction between reporting and advocacy. As this perception becomes more widespread, news consumers have become more skeptical and cynical about what they see and hear and read, and have a greater tendency to believe that all reporting is distorted by political bias and by larger commercial interests. What is worse, in fact, much worse, is that a sizable portion of our audience considers news to be just another form of reality programming, some variation of Fear Factor or The Apprentice. And as people become more detached from the national sources, from traditional sources of information, and as it becomes increasingly difficult to find trustworthy analysis, people are pushed in two directions. Understandably, some completely withdraw from what is happening around them. People get tired of being frustrated and start to redefine their concerns and interests very narrowly. This partially explains the declining number of individuals over the past few decades who volunteer in campaigns or vote in elections, or why such an incredibly small percentage of individuals are willing to even answer a polling question on the phone. When you become alienated, the easiest course of action is to simply check out. Others actively vent, and this further feeds into the rising tide of animosity and anger. Just look at the New York Times bestseller list, which is full of books accusing the other side of every imaginable political and social crime. We now have squads of talented writers and, well, some cases talented writers, on both sides of the ideological spectrum, wielding verbal brickbats and rhetorical brass knuckles. These same individuals are also appearing with far greater regularity on broadcast and cable networks. They understand that as their behavior becomes more shrill, their book sales will increase and their television ratings will grow. And this invariably leads to increasingly vituperative debates where each side believes that only it can lay claim to truth, justice, and the American way. And this approach is taken to an even greater extreme by talk radio's trial by insult format. It is amazing to watch a pack of pseudo-journalists spend hours vilifying whomever they don't happen to like at that moment. I have, however, noticed that many of these screamers seem to come from other professions: politics, law, the financial world, even academia. These so-called commentators completely ignore traditional reporting standards and seem to enjoy that their programs are little more than barroom chatter, which isn't to say they don't do damage to our social decorum, to our sense of community, and to the desire to become more engaged, and to the credibility of a profession I love. Unfortunately, or ultimately, journalism must be about news. It must seek to educate, inform, and illuminate. It cannot be the terribly uninformed shriek of opinion, nor can it be the modern-day equivalent of the Roman circuses where we publicly and savagely humiliate our latest press victim. Another manifestation of this social alienation is the rampant proliferation of superficial cynicism. It is far easier to condemn an entire political and social structure than to understand and to enhance it. How often do we hear people reject a proposal of a proposition or an idea out of hand by just calling it stupid, or worse, liberal? We see this attitude everywhere, in casual conversation, at work, at home, and yes, even in the news media. While it is easy to routinely savage elected officials, and often fun, or corporate executives, or university presidents, or anyone with power and authority, even newspaper publishers, we are starting to pay a high social price for this form of cheap entertainment. For instance, this alienation and polarization breed even more alienization and polarization, especially in younger generations. Social scientists teach us that civic habits, good and bad, are passed down from grandparents to parents to children. As the baby boomers become more disenchanted, they pass on their frustrations to the echo boom offspring and the .NET grandchildren. Cheers. This results in younger generations being less interested in the news. Consider the fact that the median age of viewers of broadcast TV news and CNN has climbed from the mid-50s, the average age, from the mid-50s to the late 50s, and now even the early 60s. For the record, the Times has successfully defied that trend. The median age of our readership has remained stable over the past decade, and one of the reasons for this is that more and more college students are getting into the habit of newspaper reading. But I digress. There is no question that the news media can play an important role in addressing all these issues, but it must first stop being part of the problem. We need to remember that the press plays such a unique role in society that it is granted constitutional protection. Our very existence depends on our ability to convince our audiences that what they read and view and hear is credible, valuable, and trustworthy. Being human, we have difficulty living up to these high standards all the time. And during polarizing periods such as now, that only becomes harder. Journalism professors, government officials, business leaders, op-ed writers, and millions of concerned citizens regularly ask whether the news media still cares about questioning authority and being an independent arbiter of truth. And some critics go even further to inquire whether these have become the quaint ideals of a bygone era. Yes, my profession has damaged its relationship with its readers and viewers and listeners, and one of the reasons for this is because we have inadequately responded to the myriad of different and difficult challenges in this turbocharged 24/7 era. Let's start with the fact that editors and reporters are constantly caught between the increasing consumer demand for more immediate information and the news media's ability to provide it. While there are fewer newspapers, there is a proliferation of real and pseudo-news programs on TV, all competing for attention, and this creates a high premium for coming out first with the big story. Too often, accuracy plays second fiddle to audience share, and serious mistakes are committed. A perfect example of this problem was when the networks looked at their polling data on the night of the 2000 presidential election and announced that Vice President Gore had both won and lost the state of Florida. And we found out that it was much too close to call. More tragically, 2 years ago, a network broke into its sports programming on Super Bowl Sunday to announce that kidnapped Wall Street Journal reporter Danny Pearl had been killed. As it turned out, it was at that time a case of mistaken identity, and the negotiations for his release continued. For a while longer, we had hoped that Pearl's captors would release our heroic colleague. The news media frequently loses its way when it attempts to compete in a marketplace with an almost unlimited number of options. The focus on ratings or readers or dollars can become so intense that it's easy to forget that reporting and editing are serious tasks with profound social and political ramifications. Too often, we respond to the competitive pressures by making less of ourselves, by offering our readers the perception of vitality in exchange for hard reporting and thoughtful analysis. An unfortunate case in point is the way the line is crossed and often obliterated between reporting and advocacy. While there will always be a role for editorial comment and people still need access to unbiased information if they're going to make thoughtful decisions about candidates and issues and thereby participate fully in this great nation's democratic process. Now add to all of this the internet, which has, despite all the dire predictions, dramatically expanded newspapers' ability to reach and meet the needs of its audiences. It used to be that you had to come to work every day, or at least leave the bedroom, to know what was going on. Now all you have to do is turn on your computer and the world is yours. As the cyber battle for customers heats up, we see numerous examples of reputations and values being sacrificed in the pursuit of a larger share of eyeballs. Online news sites recognize that one of their competitive advantages is speed, and traditional rules and practices of journalism are now being ignored with greater regularity. This takes us to another important online phenomenon, the rise of bloggers. These individuals publish weblogs that offer an ongoing narrative of their thoughts and observations. Some are professional journalists, but the vast majority of them are just folks with something on their minds. While some of these individuals are making a serious and thoughtful contribution to our global dialogue, too many simply contribute to the sense that we're in the midst of an opinion-ridden free-for-all. While this new medium requires innovative analysis and creative application, companies must still find a way to instill their core journalistic values into their online activities, especially given how important this medium is for the teenagers and young adults. To repeat, traditional news outlets want to provide our audiences with the most up-to-date information, but we still need to maintain our professional standards to continue to offer our central value proposition, providing trustworthy news and information. Of course, traditional journalists, too, have to make an even greater effort to ensure the quality of their own news reports. The public has rightly been greatly distressed by the shameful behavior of journalists like Stephen Glass, and Jack Kelly, and of course, our own Jason Blair. These reporters failed to adhere to a very basic social contract, the first clause being, "My first responsibility is to the truth." By either fabricating or plagiarizing stories, each of these individuals harmed themselves, they harmed their publications, and they harmed their profession, and they harmed society. What these incidents did was dramatically reinforce the misperception that the news media doesn't give a damn about accuracy. One of the things that I found most upsetting about the Jason Blair ordeal was that we received so few phone calls about from those individuals who were mistreated in his deeply flawed stories. They just generally assumed that newspapers operate that way. They expected that our editors wouldn't care. These problems make it much more difficult for the news media to establish a sense of connection with our audiences. The good news is that my profession is full of journalists who know that we must contend with these issues. They are extremely concerned about the quality of our national discourse and are working hard to convey the message that, one, we are guided by a set of larger philosophical propositions about the critical role of information in a democracy. 2, that we do care about the concerns, interests, and fears of our audiences and of our society. 3, we understand that when newspapers and television and radio stations and websites dispassionately and aggressively pursue the truth, they help rebuild respect for our profession and for our industry, and ultimately contribute to our country's social cohesion and stability. And finally, we know that by providing authoritative insight into a planet beset with new struggles and old biases, economic deprivation, and armed conflict, we are helping people grapple with a set of geopolitical scenarios that are more complicated and more unpredictable and, quite frankly, more dangerous than ever before. While explicitly acknowledging these critical truths is very important, what is more important is to meet and exceed the expectations of our readers and our viewers and our listeners. The mainstream news media is doing exactly this with its excellent coverage of the hostilities in Iraq. As you read about what is happening in these stories, just remember that there is a reporter or photographer or camera crew on the scene. They are doing everything they can to get the story, and this frequently means putting our own lives, their own lives, in harm's way. In fact, almost 36 journalists from all over the world have died covering the Iraq War. One more died yesterday. This most regrettably includes one of our own, the Boston Globe's Elizabeth Newfer. Earlier this year, the Times had reporters and photographers kidnapped on 2 separate occasions. In both cases, they were released, but not before they faced the very real possibility that they would all be killed. Of course, there are many other examples of the news media rising to the challenge beyond the ongoing events in the greater Middle East, such as its reporting on the worldwide war against terrorism, the communications revolution, corporate scandals, the AIDS pandemic, and the continuing debate about international trade. So there is hope that the news media can actually make things better. You may be wondering, this sounds nice, but is it in our nature to be constructive and positive? And the answer to that is an unqualified yes. I've been around this business for more than 30 years. How'd that happen? And what I have come to understand is that reporters and editors are, by their very nature, great optimists and incurable romantics. We continue to care deeply about the world and its many problems, and we passionately believe that we have the ability to change humankind's destiny and to improve our collective quality of life. I'm also optimistic for another reason. I believe that we are beginning to reverse an important socio-anthropological trend that has seriously undermined our national discourse for decades. A couple of years ago, I read a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. I recommend it to all of you. He makes a very compelling case that our postmodern lifestyle is moving in a disturbing direction, that our attention seems to be far more focused on our immediate reality, and that we are therefore less interested in the larger world around us. Clearly, this lack of civic engagement has been profoundly undermining our society and our way of life. When people become less interested in what's happening around them, they tend to cede power and control to those special interests that want to implement a particularly narrow agenda. These groups maintain their focus because they fully understand that it's in their best interest to do so. This might be changing. There are signs that people in this country are starting to become re-engaged in civic affairs. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, a record number of people for a non-presidential election, 128 million, registered to vote in the 2002 congressional elections. Another record number, 89 million, reported that they voted. There has also been a lot of discussion that the so-called .NET generation, those 40 million adults between 15 and 25, are far more interested in doing volunteer work and contributing to their community. And over the past year, a civic engagement movement has been launched on the campuses of this nation's colleges and universities to help transform our nation's cultural infrastructure. The New York Times is pleased to be a partner in this critically important effort. A Times-sponsored American Democracy Project, which now includes 190 state colleges and universities, is helping to foster academic strategies that will, to quote the program's statement of goals, increase the number of undergraduate students who understand and are committed to engaging in meaningful civic actions. I also believe that the horrific 9/11 attacks are playing a major role in this desire for re-engagement. We have certainly learned that we cannot afford to respond passively to the forces swirling around us. We now better understand how decisions are made and actions taken in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Kabul, or in Riyadh, and how they directly affect each and every one of us, from a gallon of gas to new security restrictions at our airports, to our sons, daughters, wives, and husbands bravely fighting in the war in Iraq. What has become abundantly clear is that a reinvigorated national discourse, one that allows us to more rationally consider what we must do next, is absolutely essential. And this can only happen if government, the news media, and the citizenry all insist that we communicate with each other in a different fashion. In September of 1936, at the height of that year's presidential campaign, a book was published titled America at the Crossroads. It provided a useful compendium of Alf Landon's thoughts and proposals, and its first chapter was titled The New Frontier. Catchy phrase, don't you think? The Republican presidential candidate said this: "We are aware that we must make our own joint contributions to the solutions of the problems of our times. Each generation in turn has its own problems to solve for posterity. No age has escaped this inspiring responsibility. If such there were, then that would be an age of stagnation." Alf Landon would have understood the moral and communication imperatives of this era as well as anyone, and he would have urged us all to become a little less fractious, a little less partisan, make a concerted effort to speak in a civil tongue, consider what is in everyone's best interest, and then to move forward. And that's excellent advice, and I hope we have the wisdom to take it. Thank you.
Great job, Arthur. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? Arthur, thank you for an excellent presentation, great lecture. So for people here, you remember you can go to your left or to your right, and there are microphones there. And Arthur has agreed to answer some questions here this morning, so if you'd be so kind. Well, it looks like we've got one right over here.
Good.
Please.
Hello.
Hello, welcome to the Little Apple, where you have many devoted readers of the Times. I'm one of them, so I don't want you to take this as a hostile question.
Well, God bless you, first of all.
I was wondering if you could respond to or react to the article that appeared in the New York Review of Books last June by Michael Massing. And if I could, since most people are probably not familiar with this piece, if I could read just two short sentences. For months, the Times has seemed slow to recognize important news developments out of Iraq and to give them the attention they deserve. Aside from the Abu Ghraib scandal, which has lately taken over the Times coverage, the paper has seemed intent on keeping bad news off the front page, especially when it reflects poorly on the Bush administration.
I'd be happy to. First of all, what is wonderful about this question is it shows how many Americans think that the New York Times has been kind to the Bush administration, has been supportive of the Bush administration, has been supportive of the war of Iraq, has been hiding the bad news out of Iraq. Because, quite frankly, there are, I hear, some Americans who feel the other way, that we have been unsupportive of the president and unsupportive of the administration and critical of the war in Iraq. And I think that the first response I have is welcome to the joyful job of a publisher. Right? You're going to get it from one side or the other. I am not, however, a believer that if you piss off both sides, you're probably doing a good job. I think there was some truth to that. And in particular, I think, and the Times has owned up to the fact that our coverage of the issue of weapons of mass destruction, a dreadful name, was flawed. And you might have noted a couple of months ago that we ran a long editor's note owning up to where our reporting had gone wrong, both on the ground in Iraq and more importantly in Washington and elsewhere, about whether those weapons existed and what they might be. So I think we were wrong there, and we will be wrong. There are 1,200 men and women in the newsroom of the New York Times. That doesn't include the International Herald Tribune, which we also own. It doesn't include the New York Times on the web. It doesn't include our Discovery Times journalists on television. 1,200, they're human. They're human, and they will make mistakes. And our challenge is to own up to those mistakes as fast as we can. And we were a little slow, maybe more, to own up to our errors and our coverage, in particular on the weapons of mass destruction. And that's a systemic fault. That's not the fault of any particular reporter. So I think we were slow, particularly in that area. That said, I think our coverage of the war has been superb. I would ask you to go back and look at nothing more than John Burns's coverage out of Baghdad, which has been breathtaking, I think. Two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and he should have gotten a third one, but they didn't give it to him.
We have a question over here.
Yeah.
Okay, over here.
I have two questions.
Are they allowed two questions? Okay, go ahead.
My first would be, you spoke at the beginning of the people Alf Landon admired. Who do you admire most?
I'm sorry, I spoke of people that Alf Landon admired. You were listening to the speech? That is so unfair. Who do I admire? Actually, there's the boardroom of the New York Times is a rather impressive place, and along the walls of the boardroom are photographs of men and women who have been world leaders, have been in politics, of course, but in science, in the arts, in exploration. And they're all, of course, signed, and it's very cool. But there's one part of that wall that's all alone, and on that wall is one photo, and that's Winston Churchill. So I must confess I'm a huge admirer of Sir Winston.
My second would be, you took over publication of the Times in 1992. In those 12 years, what's your proudest moment been?
What's my what?
Your proudest moment?
My proudest moment? Surviving. That's an awfully good question. I'm not sure. I could tell you, if you'd asked it, what's your worst moment, I could probably answer that. But proudest moment, I guess my proudest moment was the coverage of 9/11. It was a horrifying, terrifying, complex time, and to see how the men and women of the Times rose to that moment and under really superb leadership on the news and business sides. I don't mean me, I'm sorry, it sounded worse. I actually don't mean that. I was thinking of our editors. And I told the story earlier to a group I was having, I think, breakfast with about you couldn't get into the office, right? I mean, they had shut down New York City. And there's this one guy who works for the New York Times news service, who was in New Jersey, and he convinced somebody to lend him a rubber dinghy. And he paddled across the Hudson River. And midway through, a patrol boat stops him, right, with a machine gun pointing down, and he holds up his company ID, not even a press card, just, I work at the New York Times, and they let him through. What were they thinking? But that kind of effort, at the end of the day, when people believe so much in their mission, and that at a time like that, they know that their job is not to think about themselves, their job is to think about you, and to think about the world and our readers, that they're going to make that effort to do their job, you've got to feel you're doing something, God's work.
Okay, here's one over here.
Okay.
You mentioned bloggers earlier, and certainly there's a good amount of hacks out there that are running those, but I think there are some good ones out there, and I find that pretty much any mistake leaning either way or a bad fact will get slammed pretty quick. have you found those have kind of set a higher bar as far as fact-checking? And
I think our time has set a higher bar for fact-checking. The problem I have with so many of them is that the fact-checking is wrong, that they will find an error or claim to find an error and announce it, and it's nothing more than an error. It's not an error. It's not the right truth. A wonderful quote from an ambassador from a South American country who was complaining about a New York Times story. And when he was confronted with the fact that the story was true, he said, yes, it's true, but it's the wrong truth. And I think, have you ever been to London? If you ever go to London, go to Speaker's Corner on a Sunday. Right? Every schmo in England gets a box, stands on the box, and then starts. It just starts. And it's wonderful entertainment. It's totally insane. And you really wish they'd open the pubs and get these guys off their boxes. But too much of blogging and too much is that. It's a soapbox. It's a cheap soapbox. And I agree with you, there are some that are good. And I do know that. And there are some organizations that are good on the web. Slate is good. Salon is good. In my judgment, both bring generally journalistic values to bear, and they bring that one other thing that most bloggers lack: copy editors.
Okay, here's one over here. We'll take two more questions here. One there.
Hi, I'd just like to say two things. I don't know how involved you are, but I really appreciate the Discovery Times channel. I believe that the programming on that is excellent. It's been a real eye-opener. And the second thing I'd like to say, I've been watching news and taking in news since I was about 7. And lately I've just realized that a lot of the government says about Iraq or the economy, it's really, just statistics and fluff. And I just would like to know what the New York Times and other news agencies are trying to do to filter. I mean, I think that lately that just it, the gut, just.
Yeah, I understand. I got it. Yeah, there are no better lies than statistics. You can use a statistic to make almost any point. The challenge for journalists is not to be filter is a tough word. We don't want to get between your elected officials and you. You elected them. I elected them. We elected them. We need to hear from them. We need to hear what they're saying and what they believe, and we need to hear their arguments and their debates and their discussion. But we also need to factor into that, as journalists, other elements. Like, he chose to use 7 years in making that argument. Why 7? Well, because it doesn't work. The argument fails if you use 6 years, and it fails if you use 8 years. So you use 7, a great way of using statistics, right? So many jobs were created over what period of time. If you dice the time right, it's always going to sound good. We want you to hear the president. We want you to hear Senator Kerry, but we're going to hold them accountable for what they say, and hopefully you'll get a sense of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, here's one more.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming here to Manhattan to speak to us today.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to applaud the Times for its coverage of the troubles in Sudan. It's
Yes.
the media focusing attention on these issues that I think influences a lot of the government decisions to actually deal with these issues. But my question is this. What do you feel is the impact on the quality of news of some of these really large media companies that dominate today? And is it good for the news in any way, or strictly bad, or does it affect it?
Okay, it's a good question. First of all, on behalf of Nick Kristof, thank you. Nick is an op-ed page columnist for the Times who really has done stunning and terrifying reporting out of Sudan, really put Sudan on the map and the genocide that's taking place there. And he continues at that, and the rest of the world, thank God, is finally catching up to it, although the horror continues. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen fewer and fewer independent newspapers Newspapers owned, as the Mercury is, by the Seton family. And more of them are parts of large conglomerates or larger organizations. The Tribune Company out of Chicago, which now owns the Los Angeles Times, for example. And my own company, the New York Times, which now owns, as I mentioned earlier, the Boston Globe and some other properties around the country, although none in Kansas yet. We're working on it. Quite frankly, I can tell you some pretty lousy newspapers that are owned by chains, and I can tell you some pretty lousy newspapers that are owned by individuals. And you almost have to take it on a one-for-one basis. There's I'm blocking on the name, Ed, that New Hampshire paper. Manchester Union Leader. Manchester Union Leader. I'd let Gannett buy it. Anybody. Get it out of the hands of the people who've got it now. It's just a dreadful rag. And I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. So it goes. Other papers have been lessened, and there's no question about it. Great journalism is expensive. You can't get great journalism out of small, cheap newsrooms. If you want to run a good newspaper, you got to invest in the quality of your journalism, and that means people. And that's just the truth. That's just the facts on the ground. So it's a balance. Economic times are tough, as they have been in the last few years for newspaper business. Most newspapers contract, and even the Times has looked hard at that, and our properties have. And when times get better economically, you invest back into the quality of the newspaper, back into the quality of its journalism. So if I can leave you with one last message based on that thought, please advertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great job, Arthur. Great job. Very nice. Very nice. Arthur, thank you very much for your excellent presentation and for taking such deft care of all of these very poignant questions here this morning. And we thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you later. Thank you.